19 men hijack 4 airplanes, 2 of which are flown directly into the Twin Towers. The terrorist attack resulted in nearly 3,000 casualties, sparking the global war on terror. In response to the perceived national security threat posed by global terrorism, the Patriot Act was passed. Receiving little in the way of political opposition, the bill included provisions allowing for the indefinite detention of immigrants, expanded opportunities for the FBI to spy on its citizens without court orders, and granted law enforcement the power to conduct searches on people and their property without probable cause. The bill was originally designed to be temporary, with many of its provisions set to expire on December 31st, 2005. When the time came, however, the bill did not expire. Instead, it was reauthorized. Now, 19 years after its passing, the bill remains in effect, despite multiple federal court cases ruling many of its provisions unconstitutional. I believe there is a lesson to be learned here. Fear is a powerful motivator, one that is easily manipulated. Throughout history, governments have time and again used fear as a leverage to increase their own power at the expense of personal freedoms. Dissenting voices are often silenced by accusations of egotism. Who are you to place your own selfish rights above the safety of the collective? History has demonstrated that we should be wary when granting governments broad and invasive powers in response to a crisis. The temporary response may turn out to be not so temporary after all. On the 18th of November, 2020, the German parliament convenes in Berlin to pass a law titled Third Law to Protect the Population in the Event of an Epidemic Situation of National Importance. The law grants the government the legal authority to enforce various lockdown measures. The bill's passing comes in the wake of previous lockdown restrictions falling to judicial scrutiny. Several German courts have previously lifted individual measures due to a lack of adequate legislative authorization, something this new law seeks to address. Article 7 of the new law, Restriction of Fundamental Rights, restricts a number of so-called fundamental rights. The rights to be restricted are the fundamental right of physical integrity, the freedom of person, the freedom of assembly, the freedom of movement, and the inviolability of the home. There is no mention of the extent to which the government will be allowed to infringe on these rights. Meanwhile, thousands of German citizens gather near the parliament building to protest the bill and ongoing lockdowns, which they see as a violation of their civil rights.
In my opinion, the restrictions are disproportionate. Surely it should have been possible to come up with other measures that don't cause so much suffering. I am here for my children and my grandchildren. I will not allow their freedom to be taken away.
The demonstrators, which included families and students, reportedly came from all walks of life, ranging from the far left to the far right. The Berlin police gave out multiple citations to demonstrators for violating mask mandates. They said that their appeals for people to wear protective gear and to keep their distance from one another were largely ignored. The police department warned that officers had received orders to detain people not following the regulations. The department allegedly wrote the following on Twitter, quote, "If that does not help, the only course that remains is to disperse the gathering." After the demonstrators failed to comply with the very edicts they were there to protest in the first place, the police fire water cannons into the crowd. They follow up with pepper spray before sending in squads of riot police to forcibly disperse the demonstration. Back in March, French President Emmanuel Macron announced, quote, "We are at war with the coronavirus." Following his announcement, the French government enacted a policy mandating that French citizens stay inside their homes unless they had official documentation stating their reason for being outside. All French citizens were required to download and fill out a form where they were to list their name, birthday, and reason for being outside. This was mandatory regardless of why you were going outside, even if it was for things like grocery shopping or exercise. Police throughout the country were authorized to find those who were caught outside without a form, and 130 checkpoints were set up in Paris alone. More than 100,000 officers were reportedly distributed throughout the country to enforce the restrictions. Furthermore, Parisians specifically are forbidden from spending more than 1 hour outside of their homes each day. After the initial lockdowns were eased, this requirement was temporarily lifted. However, fast forward to October 30th, and France is reportedly experiencing a second wave of the virus. New nationwide shutdowns are announced, which results in traffic gridlocks as thousands seek to flee Paris before the shutdowns are implemented. The new lockdowns, which will last until December 1st, are to be reviewed every 2 weeks. People must again use official passes to leave their homes, as they had to during the first lockdown. Parisians are still only permitted to spend 1 hour outside each day, regardless of the distance they are able to maintain from others. In Hungary, Prime Minister Viktor Orban was granted sweeping emergency powers at the start of the pandemic. The powers reportedly included the ability for Orban to bypass Congress when implementing new regulations, effectively granting him the power to rule by decree for as long as Hungary was in a state of emergency. Initially, there was no time limit placed on these powers, which caused some to worry that Orban would henceforth rule over Hungary as a de facto dictator. These fears were seemingly shown to be baseless on the 18th of June when the Hungarian National Assembly unanimously voted to end the state of emergency. However, they simultaneously implemented a new permanent law which allows the government to reintroduce rule by decree without a parliamentary vote whenever a state of public health emergency is declared. The decision to declare such an emergency falls to the Hungarian chief medical officer. The state of emergency can theoretically be declared at any time and extended indefinitely, again without Parliament having any say in the matter, so long as the chief medical officer determines that the conditions warrant it. The Danish Parliament reacted to the pandemic by signing a temporary bill into law, one that implemented many of the same restrictions seen elsewhere in Europe. However, the Danish Parliament distinguished themselves by being the only European country that I am aware of to include a provision that would allow the government to forcibly vaccinate groups designated as high risk. This legislation was implemented in March, which was long before any vaccine for the CCP-virus had been developed. The Danish police were also granted the authority to enforce the rules put in place by Parliament. This means that if an individual designated high risk by the government refused vaccination, then it would be legal for the police to break down their door, physically restrain them, and forcibly inject them, provided they had been authorized to do so by the government. In doing research for this video, I was surprised to discover that the question of whether the Danish police would receive government authorization to enforce the government's new laws would remain academic. The temporary bill passed in March expired this month, and the Danish Parliament thus convened to draft and implement permanent legislation into law. Legislation which would empower the government to respond to future pandemics. This new legislation included a provision that would allow the government to forcibly vaccinate any group of people if the government deemed them a threat to public health. Another provision in the proposed law granted the government the authority to force businesses and organizations to hand over information about staff and members to the authorities, such as information regarding an individual's movements. The Danish Council of Ethics has reportedly criticized the bill for promoting a culture of surveillance which, quote, in no way benefits trust in society. The proposed bill caused a surge of public backlash. Danes gathered for 9 days of continuous protests. The protests reportedly resulted in the provision on forced vaccination being removed from the bill. What the bill will look like once it's ready to be passed is yet to be seen. The purpose of this segment is not to paint any and all restrictions implemented in a response to the CCP virus as authoritarian overreach. Personally, I was initially in favor of national lockdowns and travel restrictions. This was back in February and March, a time when we knew next to nothing about the virus and had no effective treatments. But that is no longer the situation we find ourselves in. Effective treatments are now available, and we have data from which I believe we can make reasonably informed decisions. To take America as an example, the Center for Disease Control published data on September 10th, which included numbers for the IFR, or infection fatality ratio, which is the number of individuals who die of the disease among all infected individuals, both symptomatic and asymptomatic. The IFR for people aged 0 to 19 was 0.003%, which means that 0.003% of those aged 0 to 19 have died as a result of being infected by the CCP virus. For those aged 20 to 49, the IFR was 0.02%. The numbers were 0.5% for those aged 50 to 69, and 5.4% for those aged 70 and older. To me, these numbers do not come anywhere close to justifying many of the measures that governments are currently enforcing, and certainly not any of the ones I have discussed in this video. They do not justify the suspension of basic rights, they do not justify crashing the global and local economies, and they do not justify the implementation of laws which will remain in effect long after the current crisis has passed. That being said, I do consider a 5.4% IFR for those 70 and older to be a cause for concern. In my opinion, such numbers justify health measures specifically aimed at protecting nursing homes. There are reports of lingering health complications for people infected by the CCP virus. Some individuals who have recovered from the virus continue to report symptoms for months after having recovered. As far as I can tell, there seems to be a correlation between the disease's severity and the severity of symptoms an individual continues to experience after having gotten rid of the virus. However, the proportion of patients that will experience these complications after having recovered is currently unknown. Also unknown is the extent to which asymptomatic or mild cases will cause similar long-term complications. Given these uncertainties, what sort of measures would it be reasonable to implement? Honestly, I don't know. As I indicated previously, I've already changed my mind about this topic, and I may change my mind again in the future as more information becomes available. That being said, as things currently stand, I don't believe that many of our government's reactions have been defensible. What's more, I no longer trust our governments to be honest with us regarding this topic. Who remembers the tsunami of articles written at the start of this pandemic telling us that masks were ineffective? Back in February, Norway's National Institute of Public Health recommended against wearing masks, claiming that they could in fact increase the likelihood of infection. Today, wearing masks on public transportation in Norway is mandatory if you can't keep at least 1 meter's distance from those around you. The reason behind this 180-degree shift in public policy is the same as everywhere else. The government lied to us because they were afraid that doctors and nurses would run out of personal protective equipment.
You said as late, and I got a newspaper article that as late as March 31st, there was no consensus on wearing masks. And the president, as you know, relies on your expertise. Do you now regret not advising people more forcefully to wear masks earlier?
Okay, we're going to play that game. Let me explain to you what happened back then.
Should be a yes or a no.
No, there's more than a yes or no by the tone of your question. I don't regret that because let me explain to you what happened. At that time, there was a paucity of equipment that our healthcare providers needed, who put themselves daily in harm's way of taking care of people who are ill. We did not want to divert masks and PPE away from them to be used by the people.
Instead of being honest with us, instead of presenting the situation as they saw it accurately, instead of asking us to make personal sacrifices for the good of those fighting on the front lines, they told us a calculated lie to control our behavior. Another lie pushed by governments everywhere was flatten the curve. We were told that the goal of the lockdowns was to flatten the curve, to prevent hospitals from being overrun by the number of new cases. We were told 15 days to slow the spread. We were told that the lockdowns were a temporary measure, one that would be lifted after the situation was brought under control. 9 months later, and here we are. While I don't typically trust governments to act in my best interest, I do trust them to act in their own best interests. Politicians have historically used crises to increase their political power, and I see no reason to believe that this time will be any different. One example of something that can be perceived as a power grab by the UK's government is a bill currently under discussion titled Covert Human Intelligence Sources Criminal Conduct Bill. The following excerpt was pulled from the podcast of the Lotus Eaters, currently available on YouTube.
The bill is about spying essentially, and spying agencies, and about giving them the powers to basically do crimes. It sounds really crude, but that's literally what it is. On the government page, you can find the summary of the bill, and also in the heading of the bill itself, it says that it is a bill to make provision for the authorization of criminal conduct in the course of the conduct of covert human intelligence sources. So they literally tell you that.
So, I mean, participation in criminal activities needed to gain trust. It enables agents to work their way into the hearts of groups that would cause us harm.
Exactly. That's the defense. That's kind of.
Hang on, just so we're clear. The authorization of criminal conduct in the course or otherwise in connection with the conduct of covert human rights intelligence. So criminal actions to get intelligence. Just so we're clear.
Yes. So basically, the people who defend this bill and who propose it, they say that secret agents need to be able to basically do some crimes to get some information that you need.
Just funny.
And in some contexts that could be true, right? So
Sure.
for example, you want to enforce anti-drug laws, so you need to get into the networks, and then you need to sell and buy stuff and take drugs or whatever.
Or 007 and his license to kill.
Yeah, exactly. And but that's exactly the point. So the major problem with this bill is that it doesn't have any specifications of which crimes are to be permitted and which are not. And so, for example, the US has long had a similar bill in place, but that bill includes the provisions against a license to kill or to rape or to torture, things like that, right? But the UK bill, that doesn't have that at all. So it's basically a blanket permission to issue these types of permissions.
So the UK government is actually, through the House of Commons, proposing that we allow secret agents to be able to rape, torture, and murder if it serves their interests.
Yes. You can see on the government webpage who's actually sponsoring the bill. It's Priti Patel and then some other person that I don't know.
Jesus
but
Christ.
Yeah, so those are the people who came forward with this, and so they say that it's not a big deal because they still need to comply with the European Convention on Human Rights, and so they say any authorization for criminal conduct must be necessary and proportionate and compatible with obligations under the European Convention on Human Rights. But the thing is, these authorizations will be granted in secret, and this will be all happening in secret because it concerns secret agents. Exactly. So no one will ever be able to know whether something like that was actually legit or not, or whether it was basically a political process, shady something in the background, right?
I find it suspicious that any government would try to pass a bill of this nature, particularly during a global pandemic. I do not believe that this bodes well for the future of European freedom and liberty. Rather, it seems to me that authoritarianism in Europe is indeed on the rise. But hey, what do I know? Am I onto something, or are these merely the ramblings of a crazy person? Let me know what you think in the comments down below.